Thanks for everyone being here. Glad to have people from here in the room and at a distance who've joined us by Zoom. We've been talking about operations. Back in January, we did our first operations clinic with our prototype engineers, who also happen to be model railroaders, gave us some great ideas. In our last month, we had small layout operations. We had two people talking about how to make a small layout operate with a lot of fun and take up a good bit of time, more than you would expect for a small room. And today we're going to do with large size operations, not scale, but large layout areas. So we have Jim Younkins and Brian Ferris for that. Just a bit of a preview of what's coming next month. We're going to have a description of a small switching layout that's connected to JMRI and how to put those two ideas together and use JMRI to drive your operations. That's going to be Scott Nelson from the Olympia Model Railroad Society. That will happen on April 12th, 1 week early, to avoid some other things that are going on in April. Then,
no, it's April 19th.
Is it April 19th? All right, so maybe April 19th. In any event, we'll be in April and you'll get your notifications on that. Followed by a May clinic, and we're back to Brian Ferris, and we're going to be talking about scratch building and kit bashing and following plans for some NP depots, actually 3 of them. And then in June, we have our Gophers trip. Jim, you want to give us a quick description of what Gophers is going to be this year?
Sure. Greater Olympia Prototype Engineering and Research Society.
Where are we going?
Yes. Suggested that we go back to the DuPont Museum just up I-5 here across from Fort Lewis, between I-5 and Puget Sound. Several thousand acres up there. Been in business at that location making powder, which is what workers call dynamite. I worked there for 2 years and never heard the word dynamite. They all talk about powder. They've made powder there from 1906 to 1976, 70 years straight. They closed in 76, and somewhere around 80, people started trying to preserve some of the stuff. Thank you, Greg.
Excellent. So that's coming June 1st. It's a little bit earlier than usual. Hopefully we'll have good weather. That's open to anybody. So you guys from Arizona and from Alaska, come on down. But you guys from Tacoma especially, join us there. And you can't lose because you get railroad and food. All right, so let's talk about operations here. We'll give the floor soon here to Brian and to Jim, but let me just review. Our prototype operator said, knowing where you are is the most important thing, so label everything. Trains are noisy, sound adds realism. Prototype crews work together, so create problems for your operators to solve together. Clean out rip tracks and icing tracks or fuel for mechanical reefers are good additions to your models and to your operations. Trains move slowly, especially in yards, so should your models. Trains don't stop fast, so momentum is realistic. Slow down for gentle coupling and wait for the air to pump up. And real railroaders read their documents. Their life can depend on it. Model railroaders should read the documents too. That one's much harder. That's probably the hardest prototype piece to follow, but it's something that we need to work on. Last month, our small layout people said real railroads don't move cars for no reasons. They do it because they're making money. So your railroad needs a purpose. Write that purpose down and follow it. Why is the train moving through your scene? And if you do that, it'll confine you into not spending too much money at the next swap meet and buying things that fit with your railroad. Adjust the complexity of operations based on the skill of your operators or how they're doing at the time. Complexity can counter lack of distance. So trade if you don't have a long railroad, make it more complex. Keep paperwork to a minimum. Paperwork takes up space, and shorter paperwork is easier to read, so that all works together. Solid track work and reliable equipment matter. Fewer options than on a big layout to work around an issue. If switch number 3 goes out on a small layout, that could tie up the whole layout, where on a larger layout, you may be able to, like in the real railroad, work your way around it. Start operations sooner than later as you're building your railroad. Guest operators will help you discover important details, important mistakes that you've made that you can fix before the scenery is in place. And don't base anything on someone else's layout. Base it on what you want to have and stick with that and stick with your story. Find and change your story, but keep it in where you want to be with your railroad. So I'm going to step out. I'm going to let Brian and Jim go. We've got a few slides from each of them. We'll go through those first, and then we'll go to the open question and answer section.
Hey, that's a really good summary.
All
It's
right.
just like being at the clinic. You did a good job.
Keeping track, and I'm going to make notes on this one. So we've got 10 people here in the room. We've got about 8 online. So when the time comes, ask some questions so we can have a good discussion.
Okay, I'm gonna get the PowerPoint going here.
I guess that's okay.
Everyone see that?
What? See what?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. My name's Brian Ferris, and I have my layout is called the Port Townsend Southern. Although if you come and see my layout, you won't see any Port Townsend on it, which is kind of a weird thing. It models a prototype that actually existed in Thurston County back in the early 1900s. And their intention was to connect a line in Thurston County up to their line in Port Townsend. That's why it was called the Port Townsend Southern, but they never made it. They ended up getting taken over by the Northern Pacific. And so really the Port Townsend Southern in my world is just a subsidiary of the Northern Pacific that's been pretty much swallowed up. But
Brian, can you minimize the participants?
but it also plays host to the Union Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Milwaukee Road have trackage rights over my layout. So they enter into it. This is a diagram of my layout, and although this is supposed to be large layouts, I would probably call mine more of a mid-sized layout. It's in a room 26 by 15, and it's kind of hard to tell on this, but it's basically a loop-to-loop. But if you look over to the far left here, the staging is in an adjacent room, which is out in the garage. So if you run from one end of the layout to the other, you run from staging in the garage through the room and out to staging in the garage again. So that's kind of the run. And then you can see the red wall here is in between the room and the garage. This is simulates a branch line for the Milwaukee Road out here called Maytown. So that's kind of the track plan. I've left the room open in the middle, which you'll see a picture of that later, which originally my plan was to fill that all up with track, and I left it open, which I kind of like because there's some breathing room in there, and it's a lot more comfortable for operations. This is a schematic of the line, which really is like the main line that exists now for BNSF. So I modeled the portion from Centralia to Tacoma, and Centralia and Tacoma are both staging. And then the stations along the way from north to south are St. Clair, Cairo, Chambers Prairie, Western Junction, Plum, Wabash, and Blakesley Junction. Chambers Prairie is the major yard. So the way that my operations work are through trains come through and drop and pick up cars at Chambers Prairie. Then locals are they're switched there, and then locals are dispatched out from Chambers Prairie. So I call that kind of a hub and spoke type of operations. And then this orange is the Milwaukee that comes on at Western Junction, and they have trackage rights through Blakesley Junction and on to Maytown. So currently my operations are really based on historical research. So this is kind of the Northern Pacific in the 1950s in disguise. So a lot of my trains are based on what I researched that they ran at the time. And Chambers Prairie really is like Centralia the way that it works. Because back in the day, Centralia was a yard where a lot of trains would drop off and pick up. and then locals were dispatched out from there to the different branch lines. So I have 4 sidings on my layout for meets. It's a mainline railroad, and as I mentioned, it's a hub and spoke where the cars are delivered to and from the yard and either collected there and picked up by through trains or set out and taken by locals. I tried to develop the layout so that there were separate areas for people to work. And that works sometimes, but not always, because people tend to get bunched up in the yard area. But once you get a train and you go out to an area, you're kind of by yourself and you can work switching there until it's time to come back. So the goal was to try to spread people out and have them work in different areas. My optimal crew size is about 6 to 9 people. I've run with as many as 11 or 12, which gets a bit crowded. Those are usually using 2-man crews, but I can run with as few as 5 or 6. And if we run with a full dispatcher and operator, then we run with 8 or 9 people. My goal has been to try to give a taste of how real railroads ran in the 1950s. And I've tried, and I'm not sure I've succeeded, to promote a relaxed feel for the session so that folks can come in and kind of work through their job and not feel rushed, hopefully, or pressured. That's a real challenge though sometimes. So for car forwarding, I use switch lists instead of car cards. So this is a train listing of what it, when you're given a train, it'll be your makeup of your train, and it'll tell you what your power is, what your caboose, what your train makeup is, where the cars are going. And it'll also give you information about what your DCC number is, so you can put that into your throttle, which may not always match the lead locomotive. And if you're coming in and out of staging, it'll tell you your staging start and end. And then if you're in the yard, you can actually draw up switch lists like the real ones used, and then switch your cars accordingly. And this is a sample of some of these switch lists that they had used. For dispatching, so it was interesting to hear the synopsis of last month's clinic about minimal paperwork and ease. Mine is the opposite end of that. I have lots of paperwork and it's pretty complex. And so I run with dispatching called timetable and train order. And the reason that I do that is because the real railroads ran that way for over 100 years by using this method of dispatching. It all keys on superiority of trains. So first class trains are superior to second, or superior to third, and if you're an extra, you're the bottom of the heap and you have to get out of the way of everybody else. And there's a set of rules that goes along with that, that you need to know who has the priority and who has the right of way. And I kind of associate it with something like when you come to a roundabout now, there's rules of who can go and who has to wait. It's a very similar methodology for trains. So they know, the crews know if they have the right way to go, or if they have to yield to someone else, and it's all via rules. So that's the method that I use. It's pretty complicated and it's pretty arcane. It's kind of like Latin, a dead language, because no railroad uses it anymore. But again, this is the way that the railroads ran for over 100 years. And I find it fun to try to figure that out. And I try to make an environment so that people, we all mess up with this because we're all learning it. So I try to invite people to enter into it and to learn, because it is a little bit of a learning curve, a lot of a learning curve. So I just try to make it so that people can learn and get a taste of how the real trains ran back in the day. Here's a sample of a train order. So you use the timetable to run by, but the dispatcher could also issue train orders to overrule the timetable. So if a train ran late, they could help other trains advance towards it instead of sitting there waiting for hours for a train that was very late. And then we issue clearance cards as well. So the result, this is a view of the layout, and you can see the open space in the middle there. So this is a crew working off to the right there. There's several guys working in the yard, and you can see the guys in the background there are working a local. So you can see they're spread out a little bit, and then I don't know what Robin's doing. I think he's making a cell phone call to someone off to the left there. He was supposed to be the operator at that session, so we give him a bad time about that. So that's my section. I'm going to turn it over to Jim now, and you want to run, or you want to let me just?
Oh, you can just do it.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be fine. So, yeah, my Mud Bay and Southern Railway it started off being totally freelanced, but it's evolved. So, or maybe I should start from the beginning. My railroad I started building it in 1997. So it's got some age to it. It's had a long time to develop and mature and expand. It's ever changing. So everything the guy said last week applies, except just multiply it by 10 or 15, right? So all the same issues, all the same problems, just multiply that by a whole bunch. So as I said, in the beginning, it was a freelance railroad, and now it's kind of a proto-freelance railroad. It's set in Southwest Washington. Originally, the setting was the area around Capitol Forest, between Mud Bay and Rochester. But it's grown. And now my railroad extends all the way out to the coast of Raymond. As far north as Tacoma, as far south as Centralia. So it's spread. And it now includes the Burlington Northern, Milwaukee, Union Pacific, Tacoma Beltline, Weyerhaeuser, and the Mud Bay and Southern. So it's a lot of railroads. If you were to walk into my basement and at first glance, you would think, what a spaghetti bowl. Oh my goodness, tracks going everywhere. That's true. They do. The tracks go everywhere, but there's a method to it, and it's actually given the constraints of size of the room, it's how I fit everything in there. So it's basically all in Southwest Washington. So on my railroad, let's see, I'll start kind of follow that outline we were doing. The diagram shows the footprint of my basement and my garage. This is an old drawing of the railroad that is probably getting close to 20 years old by now. So if I were to have a new drawing, it would be like this, but there'd be 3 of them, 1 for each level. So it's no longer just a single level layout. Now there's a bottom level that's about 24 inches off the floor, and an upper level that's about nominally 68, 70 inches on the floor.
Cooper Mini Park.
So I have local track diagrams, and those are at every place where there's a customer to serve, or a town, or a yard. There's a local diagram. Some railroads call them spins maps. This is kind of my version of a spins map, where it gives a track identification and spot numbers if there are spot numbers. Basically, it's if you're going to serve a customer at a location like this, it'll show you what all the tracks are. And this is a system diagram of my railroad that is current. So you can see the central focus, the hub of my railroad, is the Mud Bay and Southern Bordeaux Yard, which is a major classification yard. Mud Bay and Southern locals run out of Bordeaux Yard interchange is done with the Burlington Northern, Milwaukee at Bordeaux Yard. But there are other yards as well. There's secondary yards at the town of Elma, and town of Rochester has a small yard. There are larger industrial areas like Mud Bay. I don't know how many towns there are on the railroad, but I think there's probably, you could count those and you can figure it out. So every one of those little dots is an actual place on my railroad, and many of them are actual towns. Yeah, originally, in the very beginning, I wanted to build an operations-oriented railroad. For years, I had been a regular crew member on a large end scale layout in Tacoma, owned by Roy Cutler, and I just couldn't believe my eyes at first. I went to his house. His railroad took up the entire lower level of a split level house, and he felt absolutely no qualms at all about drilling holes through walls and going from room to room to room with his railroad. And I just got so hooked on that concept that I started originally with a fairly small railroad by comparison to what I have now. And that was going to be it. And it all was based on the local area just west of Olympia. And then it just began to grow. As I said, the current railroad covers Thurston, Mason, Lewis, Grays Harbor, Pacific, and Pierce counties. So, yeah. And what's the railroads that are present on Mud Bay and Southern Layout? Types of trains listed are, there are a lot of transfers between yards because there's a lot of interchange traffic. Primarily with the Milwaukee and the BN. I have several local switch jobs. Most of them actually come out of Bordeaux Yard. There's a couple that come out of Elma, a couple that come out of Rochester, and so on. Usually, I like to have around 12 to 14 operators. That's I consider a full crew, and we can run on a good operating session in 4 hours. We can run 20 to 25 trains. Some of my trains actually are a little on the complex side, so I never know how long an operator is going to take to do a job. So sometimes I think, well, gosh, he can finish his job in an hour, and they spend the entire afternoon there. So I didn't intentionally make puzzles. You know, I wasn't trying to do a time saver or anything like that, but it just turned out that way. But it actually, and I base this a lot on the prototype, right? The railroads are businesses. They don't like to spend a dime if they don't have to. They're always looking for a return on their investment. So I didn't put a lot of tracks in just to make things easy to operate. You have to study the track and figure out your moves, just like a real crew does. The difference is a real crew gets trained on a job for at least a week or two before they're turned loose on it by themselves. And in the model railroad world, it's often a matter of minutes, and you're assigned the job to figure it out. So I never know what to expect from session to session. Here's an example of my train instructions. I have learned over the years that model railroaders, even though they can read, they don't like to read. And the more information you give them, the worse it is, and the more confused they get. And what started off as like 4 pages of instructions, got boiled down to this tiny little instruction thing with just the bare minimum amount of information. And unfortunately, even then, a lot of people, they don't read the instructions until they get stuck somewhere. I'm guilty of that too. So I can't fault them for that. It's just the nature of guys, I guess. I don't know. Here's an example of a card in a waybill. So I model an N-scale. N-scale train cards are very small. The reporting marks on a car are very hard to read. And somewhere, as I was trying to figure out if I was going to use card cards or switch lists or whatever, I saw an article by somebody in some publication, and I can't remember what it was, where they had put a photograph of each car on each card card. And I thought, bingo, there we go. So it works well. So every card card, to give you an idea of if Rybates was going to use card cards, he wouldn't need pictures because he has so few cars and they're so big. It's pretty easy to figure out. Right now, as it sits, getting ready for sound rails, there are plus or minus 100 or so, about 1,000 cars on my railroad. And so making card cards and waybills is quite a job. But it didn't happen all at once. But this is a good example of the waybills are super simple because, again, too much information just confuses the issue. And all we really need to know is where the car is going. Here's a typical set of card boxes, or I have a box for inbound cars, box for cars that are being held for loading, and a box for cars that are being picked up. Here's a wave view of a typical scene on my railroad where I've got a staging yard on the bottom level, the main original middle level, and the brand new upper level.
There's always the main floor under the kitchen table.
No.
There are limits, no.
Well, you know, I have the nicest wife in the world, but she forbids trains running upstairs in the main part of the house. I can have all the trains I want downstairs. So that's okay.
Did you want to show the questions? Or?
Yeah. So these are the same questions we asked for. All right, I had a closer microphone. These are the same questions we've been asking. Did you have a track plan and design operations to use the track? Did you have a track already laid out and then design your operations around that? Or did you design your operations and build your track? Or did you do a little both? And so both of you can answer that because I know you have different answers.
Well, my layout was a second version of the theme that I have now. And the first one was much smaller, and a few of you got to operate on that. And it was the first option there. Did you have a track plan, design operations to use your track? So I shoehorned operations into a already established track plan, which we made work, but I learned a lot about what didn't work. So I had the opportunity to build a new layout, and I tried to lay it out for operations. So it would be the second option where I designed my operations and knew what I wanted, and then built the track plan to fulfill that.
Wow. So none of the above. I knew from the very beginning of designing, thinking about my railroad, that it was going to be operations oriented. I had caught the bug from Roy Cutler, and I knew what I wanted. I never ever dreamed I could have a railroad as big or complicated as his. Mine was initially going to be really simple in a corner of the basement. So I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted operations, but I didn't really know where I was going to put the track, how I was going to design it. But the room sort of dictated what I did. I had already figured out the building along the edge of the room against the walls was a good way to do it. So the walls are there, so you can go down this wall and that wall, or that wall and that way. You've got to, it's basically there it is. Another criteria I had was I wanted defined spaces. I didn't have all the different rooms I could go into like at Roy's layout. I had a fairly open basement with a stairway coming down in the middle. And so I designed a couple of peninsulas that come away from the wall to basically define spaces so that, and it's just the opposite of your concept. Mine, when you leave the main part of the basement and go off into a corner of the basement, you're on your own. You're isolated, and you can kind of get into the mood and all this. So the track plan evolved. I built the bench work where the only places the bench work could go, and then the track had to follow the bench work. That made sense to me. So, and then I had no idea what the track plan was going to be. I went through literally 2 tablets of graph paper drawing track plans. And I was drawing track plans even before I knew I was going to build a railroad. So I had a lot of experience drawing track plans, but when it came to actually designing and building my railroad, I didn't have a clue what to do. I couldn't follow my track plan. It just basically, all I can say about drawing track plans is it gave me a good feel for things I couldn't do. So there was a benefit to doing it. I learned a lot. So the development of the railroad followed operations, basically.
But both methods are completely successful.
So I want to follow that up with a couple of questions. So Jim, did you place buildings in place and then put tracks to them, or did you put tracks down and build buildings to fit?
I put buildings down first. I ran the track to the buildings, but I didn't glue it down. And then I would move the buildings and move the track. And I would do that until I found something that looked right, felt right, and would operate. And then once I figured out this is good, then I started gluing things down. Actually, I came into a windfall. I was at a swap meet in the early stages of development of my railroad, and I bought a really big cardboard box full of old used N-scale buildings. And you can get a whole bunch of buildings in a big cardboard box. So I had all these basically, I wouldn't consider them usable. I don't think I have any of them anymore. But they were great for laying out so I could see how things fit. And these days I just take a fill marker and draw things on the bench top as I'm designing things. But yeah, it was basically start with a vision of what I want and then design the track. And I don't glue it down until I really know for sure what I'm going to do.
And with a lot of space, which you have relatively compared to a lot of us, you can do that. Brian, you had a little bit different process. Is that right?
Yeah, and listening to Jim talk, I actually, when I had the room built, it was a purpose-built room, I actually was designing the layout in a CAD program. So I knew exactly what it was going to be. And for the most part, I've stuck to that through the whole time. I had some industries already that I was bringing forward from my old layout. So I knew how much space they took, and I designed the track to fit down. to some extent. And for the most part, I've kept with that plan here 14 years later. There's still, I've changed it and modified it a little bit, but not dramatically.
One thing I would say is that I do know people that have carefully designed a railroad. They've drawn it all out, they worked it all out, and they built exactly what they've designed. And I envy them. I think that's great because you can design it on paper and then go build it, and it's just what you want. I'm more the other side. I'm more like the artist side of this, where I have a hard time planning. And so for me, it's more productive if I just start going at it and let it develop as I go, kind of like an artist doing a painting.
One of the things I'll just say real quick about using a computer program to design your track plan is it keeps you honest. So you tend to, if you're designing with FlexTrack and you have a minimum radius, it's like, well, I'll just fudge that in there. With the track planning software, if you lay it in there and it goes through the wall, then you know your curve is not going to make it. So it does keep you honest.
Do you know that you can build a turnout too tight for a car to go around?
Somebody's done that?
And how would you know this?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me take you through another question. When we had Lee Bishop here last month, his layout is from one corner to the other. And, you know, it's from here to there layout. Rye Bates has really got maybe two here's and one there, but pretty much linear. You guys mentioned something about a hub and spoke design. Can you talk about that?
So mine is a point to point. If you run it from staging to staging, right in the middle of it is the yard where you exchange cars. So that's kind of the hub. And then the cars are distributed out from that. So that's what I mean by that. But I have a point-to-point layout, pretty much. I do have a return track that I can use for open houses where I can run continuous operations, but that's not used during an operation.
You have a mini hub. You have many hubs in your vehicle.
So my railroad started off as just a simple, straight railroad, just point A to point B. It was Mud Bay to Rochester, main line all the way around. And along the way, I decided, well, wouldn't it be fun to have a branch line go off in a different direction? Well, I have the space, and I understood the concept of what I wanted to do. So I put in a junction and then created a branch line, and that worked well.
So is junction's the more appropriate railroad word for a hub then? Is that?
No, the junction is far away from the hub is the yard, much like Chambers is a yard. And this is just simply, what do you think? Well, how about Olympia Belmore Railroad? That's pretty simple. That's just down, at least Olympia up to Mottman. But what if at Capitol Lake, where the Y is, that spur still went down to Tumwater? That would be more like what I'm thinking.
And one point I think that Jim is kind of bringing up is every time you add something like that, it adds a complexity to your operations because you have to account for traffic to and from that and how you're going to aggregate it and how you're going to sort it out. So every time you add a branch line or an industry or a major junction with an interchange with another railroad, you have to figure out how you're going to route cars back and forth.
Because real railroads did that because they wanted to make money.
And that's the way they operated. They interchanged cars with other railroads, and there was they all had branch lines that fed their main lines. So
the current issue of the Great Northern Gold shows the Great Northern map, the main line going across North Dakota and branches. It must be every 15 or 20 miles. There's just one after another. I didn't count them up, but it looks like there's 10 or 12. Zing, zing,
and
zing.
then when they were constructing those lines back in the day, that's how they were feeding traffic onto their main line. It's not so much anymore. A lot of those branches have been abandoned, and major class ones are point to point pretty much. But back in what the era I'm modeling, that's how they functioned. They were delivering cars to other railroads and picking them up, and delivering cars to industries and picking them up, classifying them, and then sending them on their way.
I read that at one point, the Northern Pacific, all by themselves, had over 3,000 miles of track in Washington State. So branch lines going everywhere.
Like we're about 300 miles wide.
Yes, exactly,
Somebody
exactly.
has a question online.
Okay. Yeah, so this would be a good time to open up for questions. We'll finish up with our presenters giving us their 3 ideas on things to do, but let's go with questions either from the room or from our Zoom people. You'll have to unmute your microphones for Zoom. Yes, in the room here.
Oh, I'm HO, sorry.
Okay.
Both of you mentioned that you want to do, that your goal was operations from the get-go. Did you have some thought as to how many operators you thought you were going to have? And like, Jim keeps growing. He probably started with an idea of maybe 4 or 5, and now you're up to a dozen.
Yeah.
And Brian has been very good at appetite suppressing and not growing.
Yeah, so the question was
What you got?
kind of the size, target size of operations, how many people, things like that. It's very tempting when you have a layout to add people and add trains, right? Because you have more people over, you got a ton of locomotives you collected, so you want to put more trains on. It's very tempting to do that. You very quickly reach a saturation point where nobody can move and it's choked. So I try to resist the temptation of growing my operations by inviting more people, because it just becomes a meltdown, kind of like the real Union Pacific did 10 years ago. And it's really a balancing act, and it's really a temptation, because you want to have more guys over, right? And it's my wife calls them train parties. You want to have more people over to your train party, but you can't.
Lee Bishop made a really good comment about that last month, where he said, know the story of your railroad and follow that
Stick to
story
it.
so you don't
Scope creep.
stretch too far.
Scope creep is really tempting. And I'm sure that we've all been to layouts where it is a spaghetti bowl and you go to an op session and nothing's moving. The other temptation is that you've got all these freight cars you bought over these years and you want them all on the layout. And there's no place to classify cars. You don't have any open tracks. So you got to be really careful about how many cars you have on the layout. There's a tipping point where there's no capacity to sort.
And that doesn't matter by layout size either.
No.
That happens big or small.
So I don't have all my cars on the layout at any given time. I pull them off, have a portion that are off in storage, because it's too much if they're all on the layout. Now, sometimes it happens naturally, and it happens in the real world naturally too, where you get choked because a bunch of trains show up at the same time. But I really try not to do that intentionally. And I remember operating at a layout where I had a train and I had no place to sort my cars because all the tracks were tied up. It was kind of frustrating.
Would you say in operations that for number of cars and the number of guests and stuff, that your pacing entity is your yards? Bordeaux is your whatever Bordeaux can do, that's all I can do, and that's.
I think it depends. I think it depends on how you run it. So if I have every train hit Chambers Prairie, then that's going to be a problem. I have some that bypass it though and don't touch it. So it depends on what the role that yard plays. But and that's a key, I think, to some op sessions where again they can melt down if they're dependent upon all trains going through the yard and they're overtaxed, and the poor yard master is trying to keep up. And I've heard that comment a lot about other layouts, that if your yard gets choked, and the whole session grinds to a halt. So it's pretty tricky in a large layout to figure that out. And to kind of answer your first question, I didn't know, so I had to have sessions to find out what the sweet spot was and how many people I could accommodate and how many trains I really could run and how many trains I could really run at one time. So I try to have a sequence and not have more than 2 or 3 on the main line at any given time. Sometimes it's unavoidable just because the way it goes, but if you put 6 out there at once, you're gonna melt down or whatever.
And that's back to that comment of start running early, start operating as soon as you possibly can. Find these things out because it takes a while to get
It
there.
really does.
So 1,000 cars sounds like a lot of cars, but really, I've got like 500 feet of main line, right? So the railroad absorbs that many cars. You'd never guess there were that many cars there. But it's all about management, managing your traffic flow, managing the number of trains you run at one time, the density. And if things go amiss, and you could wind up with 3 trains coming into the yard at the same time because you had no idea how long these operators were going to take to do a job. They all converge at once. Well, the yard's choked up, and then nothing moves until I get it straightened out. On the other hand, if things go according to plan, then everything can run smoothly. So
you really learn what the real railroads go through with their capacity planning by doing one of these. And they struggle with this too, right? They don't want 3 trains showing up at the yard at the same time, but sometimes it happens. And so, I happen to know a yard master in a prototype world, and he worked in a yard, and if they were stuffed and a 3rd train showed up, he told them they just had to wait until they had room. So that's how they manage that.
There's another design thing. I would say 99% of all track plans that have been published in MR or Craftsman show maybe 2 yards at each end, possibly a town or 2 or 3 on a big layout or 4 in between. And it'll be the main line going through that town in a passing siding with spurs off of that to switch. That is a recipe for clogging your railroad, not just in the main yards, because if there's only that passing siding, the guy who's in the hole cannot continue to switch until that train that has the right of way is passed through. But if you have a 3-track arrangement in your intermediate towns, the switcher or the local freight continue to work because he's got a runaround track, irrespective of that mainline passenger or a hot rod freight train that's flying through
That's
there.
a really good point. So the comment, if people online could hear, is that, if you have your switch lead is on your main line, you're going to run into trouble. And that was one of my design considerations, is to have a long lead that was not on the main line. So the crew could continue to switch while traffic was passing by and not interfere with it. And that's worked out pretty well.
Any questions from the online people?
There's RBLOLV as I his hand up.
Robert Love, is that right? Is your hand up or is that on our end of the screen?
Oh, it was mine.
It was on ours. Okay. Any questions from the online group?
Yeah, I have a question. It's maybe not as operational, but I am curious on Jim's car cards. When he took the pictures for those car cards, how did you photograph those and scale those down to that size for your cards?
I use an Apple computer, and the photos suite that comes with the computer is super simple to use and has a lot of powerful tools. So basically, I just use my phone. I found that my phone is the very best camera for photographing my equipment. And then it's just simply moving that over to the computer and just cropping it down. And I don't really worry about the file size or the image size, because when I move that, I just drag it over to my word processing program where I'm doing my car cards, and just paste it in, and I can resize it to fit the card in the word processing program. So I don't know how you would do that with Microsoft. I'm still trying to figure out how Windows 10 works. I haven't figured it out yet. There
Yeah,
must be
I
a
was just
simple
curious.
way
I
to
had
do-
somebody ask me to do a test like that many years ago. And I just, I used my camera and then trying to scale something down and print it out, and that didn't work. And I don't know, I don't do it for mine. And so
Right,
when I saw
so
that, I thought I'd ask. So,
I did use
Microsoft
my
is very
camera initially.
straightforward on that.
It is very. I would use my camera and I get like this 7 megabyte file for this one picture, but it's in Photos. You just crop it down and then you just drag it over to word processing, and it may still be a big file, but the image itself is small. So
cool, thank you.
Yeah.
It kind of goes to my question of with these big fleets, how do you manage your fleets, your car fleets, your locomotive fleet? A protocol for when I get a new car, how does it enter my collection, or retire one or rotate them out is what you're talking about to make sure that those.
yes. So believe it or not, I don't have all of my rolling stock on my railroad. I've been a collector for a long time, and there's another, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds more cars in my train cases that are, sometimes I rotate them on and off, but basically processes these days, I won't buy a new freight car unless it has body mount couplers and metal wheels to start with, and if it meets that criteria, then I simply go through it and make sure that the trucks are free enough, that they're adjusted properly, wheels are gauged, the car's weighted right. And I go through that. If you're going to have reliable operations, you've got to take the time to make sure your rolling stock is up to snuff. And then I usually weather them a little bit. I'm not patient enough to spend hours per car, but I can do fairly believable crime like on this reefer car here with an airbrush, and that just takes a minute and I'm done. Okay, it's got some grime on it, now I can go on the railroad. And then this is really difficult for me because I don't have a lot of discipline, but I promised myself that every time I put a new car on the railroad, I take an old one off. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. It's like after a while they get familiar, like they're your children. You don't want to just take them off.
Not my favorite.
So
Administratively,
as you probably know, I've written a database program where I enter the cars in and track them that way. So I know that every location where they are, and that includes when they're off the layout. And I do the same thing as Jim. I go through a regiment where I check a number of things, the coupler height, if it rolls well, what the weight is, and I have painfully gone through and done a little bit of weathering on every single car. So it has to go through all that before it gets onto the layout, and I keep track of when I service those in the database, so I know if I haven't looked at something for a while. Just to give everyone an idea, about 250 cars on my layout and about 50 locomotives, and I have around 45 passenger cars, but only probably 14 or 15 of them on the layout at a time. So I try to be very disciplined as well, and I've been trying to upgrade my fleet. So I've been buying better cars at swap meets and getting rid of the older ones, but I have a hard time parting with some of my old babies too.
So Brian, early on you said that your first layout was tracked first and then you wanted it to become an operational railroad. And I think that could be the situation for a lot of the people that are watching this or hearing with us, that they've got a railroad started and they're getting interested in this operations thing. What do you do to take a run around railroad and start operations?
Well, I built a layout and it was okay. It wasn't great, but it ran reasonably well. And I actually had Jim over one time and he said, you should invite some people over to run this. And I said, you're crazy. And so he and you and a couple others came over and that actually evolved into some okay operations. I think we learned a lot and I think we had a lot of fun doing that.
Oh, yeah.
And especially the operator that had to stand outside and work through the window. If you guys
quite
remember
that bad, but it was close.
I had a window next to the layout and sometimes you had to go out there to reach in to uncouple the car because there wasn't any room to get back there. But we had some fun with it and, you know, it actually worked okay. And I evolved the operations based on what I knew how railroads ran to kind of make it seem like it was doing something and it was okay. And I learned a lot about what I didn't want to do with that.
So if you've got a siding or two, you can have operations.
Well, I think, it depends on what you want to do, but you have to have industries and delivering cars to industries and picking them up, I think is where you really get the operations going and then taking them to some kind of a yard to classify them or to forward them on. And, I think it's really important that that layout had staging. That's what you really have to have because otherwise you're just looking at the same cars over and over and over. They have to go away and they have to come back or others have to come. So it makes it look like they're going to a different, the rest of the world and they're coming from the rest of the world. I think that's a key component for if you have an existing layout and you're trying to set up operations and you don't have staging, I think that somehow you have to figure out how you're going to get cars on and off the layout. Whether it's a fiddle yard or staging or whatever.
One more question, Jim, go ahead.
On the question of operation in mind first or track plan in mind first, a third option, which as far as I know only one guy in the whole world has ever done, is scenery first. John Allen actually reserved a part of his layout and built a scenery with no track and no track in mind. And then surveyed that area and ran track through there just like the Union Pacific going. Yeah, it was the only part of the layout, of course, that he ever did
That would
that.
be
But
interesting.
God, that was just really, really something.
I've done that after the fact.
Yeah, you're pretty close, I would say.
Whoops, I'm destroying.
But yours is mostly flat ground and this was hilly territory through a canyon. So he had to survey through that canyon.
That's nice.
All right, I'll be doing a little work here. Just a second. Okay, Brian, keep your feet back.
I destroyed the sound system with my big fat feet.
All right, thanks for that break for technical difficulties to be corrected. The last thing I want is for, like the other people have told us, 3 things each of you would think that's important to make operations work. And specifically for a large layout, but it could be that it applies to any layout.
I'll
go first.
Sure. I think Dry was hit the nail on the head when he said, have a story for your railroad, a history or something to define your railroad. That you can stay with it. That will lend some context to it, and then you can work off of that to develop your railroad. So there's one important aspect. For an operational railroad, as Brian just said, having off layout staging is important. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Rise Pez dispenser he's got to move cars on and off, or whether it's a multi-track hidden yard someplace. But having staging is really important. And I think being willing to adapt and make changes to your railroad as you operate it, you have new people come in, give you new ideas. don't be afraid to go, oh, well, maybe I should do this instead. I can't tell you how many times I've taken a whole scene and soapy water and a putty knife and has removed everything and started over again because somebody gave me a better idea. Or it could be as simple as adding a siding somewhere that you didn't think you needed. So just having the ability to adapt and make changes and just if you've built something from scratch, you can certainly rebuild it. So don't be afraid to do that.
So a couple things that come to my mind is I have this thing called ops fidelity continuum. So it's a line, and on one end is totally accurate prototype ops, and on the other end is, you know, somebody walks in the room and you hand them a throttle and say, go at it and do whatever you want, right? So those are the two extremes. You're gonna land on that line someplace, and you can't be 100% accurate, and hopefully you're not just having a free-for-all. So you're going to land in there someplace. So choose where it is you want to be. Do you want to be super realistic? Then you lean towards the one end. Do you want to just have some friends over and run trains and have some snacks? Then you lean towards the other end. And once you land there, then you can make your operations match that, right? So if you want to be running with modeling a prototype, then you could study that prototype and lean towards the more high fidelity operations. If you have a make-believe, you know, Disneyland type train and you want to just run around and pick up cars and set them out, you know, then you're more on the other side. So that would be one thing. The other thing we've talked about several times is bulletproof. I think Ry used the word bulletproof track and rolling stock. Run your trains until you can't stand it anymore, and then have someone come over and run them, and make sure that they run in. You're not going to get perfect, but make sure that you minimize derailments and that your electrical is good and your switches throw all the way, all those kinds of things. That will go a long ways towards making your operations enjoyable, because it can be very frustrating if every time they go through a switch it derails or whatever, you know. I think the other thing that I would say, and this is a hard one, is, and Jim touched on it a little bit, is be open to feedback. And if somebody suggests something, and I tend to not listen to them at first and say, oh, that's ridiculous. And then when they leave, I start thinking about it, and pretty soon I'm doing whatever it was that the person suggested. It's like, you know, that's a pretty good idea. So being open to feedback about what you could do or change, or what's good or not so good with your operations. I try to do that. I don't do it very well, but I eventually get there when people suggest things. Just a side note, I belong to the OPSIG, and they have a group IO email list that comes out way too often. But they recently had a survey, and these are people that are on there are pretty hardcore operators. And the question was, why is a layout fun to operate? And somebody compiled all the answers. And amongst some of the top ones were qualified dispatcher, qualified yard master, so that things are rolling well. An understanding and friendly host, open to feedback, which is what I think we were both just talking about.
Yeah.
I tend to get pretty uptight, and I try to be understanding and friendly, but you have a lot going on, and it's hard to do that sometimes when you're managing a lot of things and things aren't going right. But being an understanding and friendly host, I think, is really important. Not spending excessive time in sidings or waiting to enter a yard. So if you get a train and you sit for an hour and a half waiting, that's no fun. People have not come to sit in sidings. They come to run trains. So waiting for 10 or 15 minutes may be necessary, but you know, excessive time is bad. Railroad runs well. We just talked about that. People that are available to coach you or mentor you, if you have helpers there, that's a good thing. Operators are kept relatively busy. Beverages and food, that was one that came up. Running more than one train during a session, so getting a variety of jobs is something. And then the last one is at least minimal scenery. Now, you don't have to have everything complete to have operations, and there's plenty of plywood Pacifics out there that do decent operations, but having some scenery, I think, is appealing to people when they come, so they can kind of get what it is you're trying to model. So those are some of the things, just to add on, that I would call operation geeks have brought up as some of the most important things of why a layout is funny.
Anything else here before we wrap it up tonight? Got two in the front here. You guys fight over who's first.
Who's here?
I picked up one more thing. Both of you was a common thing. You started small and grew out from there, but you started, and I think some people might get you know, paralyzed on top dead center, thinking they got to have their dream layout all the way done and built before they even start running. Versus, you know, it sounds to me that both of you started something that was good enough for one or two guys to actually do something, and then started growing up. Even if you had a long range CAD design program in the future, we're still starting early.
Yeah.
And so not only are we testing our stuff as it is, but we're allowing it to evolve as it goes.
Well, and along with that, you learn about how to do operations. You learn how to have people over, to manage the jobs. There's a lot to this besides just handing someone a throttle and running a train.
They don't have any idea what you have in your
Right.
locked in your head, and then they can't do it.
Planning, you know, figuring out how you're going to route cars, you know, so I think with a smaller layout, you can kind of get your feet wet and understand, you know, you can grow with that and learn. You learn a tremendous amount. And somebody said this, I think, at the last session, is you bring someone over to run on your layout, you're going to learn so much because they're going to do things different than you do, and approach a job completely different than what you've done. And then before you know it, they're doing something that's like, I've never seen a locomotive go up that track before. You know.
You're spot on, Bias. It's if you really do want to have trains running, and you may only have one wall in a spare bedroom or something, maybe you could build something 18 inches wide and 12 feet long. That's a start. And you can have a lot of operations, a lot of fun on just something as simple as that. There are some really phenomenal railroads, yours and Lee's come to mind immediately, that are fantastic small railroads. So you don't have to have a huge basement to build a railroad in. You can have lots and lots of fun in a small space or a big space. You know, I never ever imagined my railroad was as big as it is now, and in fact it's probably too big for me to maintain by myself. But it just happened. I just kept getting ideas. This whole new expansion I'm working on now started during the pandemic, because a couple of years before that, one of my friends was goading me into building a lift-out bridge across my garage door. What a dumb idea. Where's it going to go? During the pandemic, I got really bored. And I started looking at that. Sure enough, it works great.
I have some stuff too. So we're going to wrap this up, the operations part. Next month, you know, tune in or be here to see how somebody took a time saver track plan, connected it to an operations program, and built operations and designed some trains to run on that layout and design some switching moves. And that may help fill in kind of the rest of the details on how you create an operating layout. I'm going to take all of the notes that we've come up with, especially the 3 things that each person has said, and put them together and get them out to everybody eventually, similar to how I started out this meeting. I read the ideas. And we'll have the Olympia Operations Clinic cheat sheet for how to have an operating session when we're all done with this. So thank you for your questions. That really helps make our presentations go well. Thank you for our presenters.